It's game time
Back to reality
with Mrs. Klein.
and Mr. Creighton.
And we are here today with your Chapter 10, Lesson 3 podcast entitled Plague and the 100 Years' War. As a reminder, in the last podcast, you learned about how the Crusades lessened the power of feudal lords. In this podcast, you're going to learn about events in Europe that weakened feudalism even more. Okay, all right. There are vocabulary terms and words that you're going to need to be familiar with because, of course, we're going to have a podcast quiz coming up. The words this time around are bubonic plague, 100 Years' War, Joan of Arc, and longbow. A reminder that when you hear this sound, you've heard a vocabulary word in the podcast.
Just a reminder, the big idea for this unit, conflict brings about change. The first essential question, what impact did feudalism have on medieval Europe?
Number 2, how important is keeping order?
Number 3, how do civilizations change and adapt after conflict?
And finally, how does religion play an important role in shaping civilizations?
All right, our first section is titled The Plague. You can find this in your textbook. Hopefully you're following along on pages 333 to 334. The question you guys should be thinking about, how did the bubonic plague affect Europe in the 1300s? In the 1300s, the bubonic plague struck Europe. Before the end of the century, this deadly disease had killed about 1/3 of all Europeans and tens of millions of people worldwide.
Dang, that's a lot of people.
A lot of people.
Okay, the plague reached Europe in 1347. A trading ship brought the disease to Italy. From there, it spread along European trade routes to France, Germany, and England.
A bacteria carried by fleas caused the plague. Infected fleas attached themselves to rats. From rats, the fleas jumped to people. When fleas bit humans, people quickly became sick. About half of those who got the disease died, usually within days.
The plague caused a sharp drop in population in Europe. The loss of so many people upset daily life and made the world seem less orderly and safe. The drop in population also affected the economy. Europe had fewer workers. In many places, workers were so scarce that laborers demanded and got much higher pay for their work. Okay, you should be able to answer this question now, you guys. What were 2 ways the plague affected Europe?
Our next section, the 100 Years' War. You can find this on pages 335 and 336 of the textbook. The question you guys should be thinking about, who fought in the 100 Years' War? The 100 Years' War lasted more than 100 years. Shocking. From 1337 to 1453, France fought England. The war was not one long battle, but a series of shorter conflicts. At times, the fighting stopped because of peace agreements, the plague, and other events.
The war had many causes. The King of France wanted control of the land in southern France claimed by the King of England. The French king made the English angry by arresting English merchants and interfering with England's trade with the continent. Fighting began in 1337 after the English king declared himself the true King of France. He based his claim to the French throne on the fact that he was nephew of the last French king.
At first, the war went well for England. The English won several major battles. By 1422, their armies had gained control of much of France. In 1429, however, the war turned in France's favor. Led by Joan of Arc, the French defeated the English in a battle at Orleans. Inspired by this victory, the French fought harder. By 1453, they had forced the English out of France, ending the war.
Before the 100 Years' War, knights on horseback fought each other face to face, with swords, axes, and lances. During this war, however, new weapons changed the way armies fought. With the longbow, an archer could shoot large arrows, at the enemy from great distances. French soldiers found new uses for the gunpowder invented by the Chinese. On the battlefield, they won many battles by firing artillery, which are large guns loaded with gunpowder. Okay, you guys answer this question right now. What new weapons were used in the 100 Years' War?
All right, our final section is Early Modern Europe Emerges. You can find this on page 336 and 337 of the textbook. How did social and political structures of medieval Europe change? Part of how historians define the end of the Middle Ages is the end of feudalism.
European towns grew and sought more stability. Strong monarchies could provide stability, and towns became centers of support for the monarchies.
After the Hundred Years' War, monarchies in Europe grew stronger. The French king no longer had to worry about the English king claiming his throne. The French monarchy would eventually become the best example of an absolute monarchy. New ideas about learning, science, and art would lead to the European Renaissance. Question you guys should be able to answer in your head right now? How did life change during the Middle Ages?
Okay, as a reminder, we've got those podcast quiz coming up, and here are your vocabulary terms this time. Bubonic plague, 100 Years' War, Joan of Arc, and longbow. All right, you guys, this podcast is approved.
I don't get it.